Okay, good evening to those who've joined us for our shir tonight, the Monday night mysticism class on Parshas Omer. So what we're going to focus on tonight is the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer, the counting of the Omer, which is found in this week's Parsha. And it also relates to the time of year that we are in between Pesach and Shavuos, where every night we are fulfilling the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer. We know that the Torah exists on multiple levels, starting from the literal reading of the psukim and the observance of their mitzvahs in their halachic sense. But every mitzvah also has its deeper inner meaning, as is explained in the teachings of Sod, the pnimius of Torah, the hidden dimension of Torah, articulated in the writings of Kabbalah and in the teachings of Chassidus. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at the mitzvah of Sefiras HaOmer, not in its classical halachic form as a mitzvah that we perform each night when we count the Sefira, but rather to understand what is the inner spiritual Avodah that we are supposed to be doing. What is the deeper meaning of the Sefiras HaOmer, and how it is a time where we should actually be focusing on refining and developing part of ourselves. So I think it's in order that we quickly run through the source of the mitzvah, the way it is written in the parsha, just to understand the mitzvah in its practical sense, and then we will jump into the deep end and to look at its mystical meaning. So the pasuk says, "Usfartem lachem." This pasuk many people actually quote in the tefillos, the prayers associated with the counting of the Omer from Parshas Omer. Usfartem lachem mimacharas haShabbos. You should count for yourself from the day after Shabbos. And in this context, the day after Shabbos, the sages explain, does not mean the day of Shabbos, but rather refers to the first day of Pesach, which is a Yom Tov. Yom Tov can also be called Shabbos because it's a day of rest. So you shall count for yourself from the day after the first day of Pesach, from the day on which you bring the Karban Omer, which was a Bali offering that was brought in the Beis HaMikdash. You should count Sheva Shabbosos, you should count 7 weeks, to Mimois Tihiena, and these weeks should be complete. Ad Mimachras HaShabbos HaShvius, until the end, the day after the 7th week. Tisperu Chamishim Yom, you should count 50 days. Vikravtem Mincha Chadash Al Hashem, and then on the 50th day, which is the festival of Shavuos, you should bring a new offering to Hashem, which was the Shtei Alechem, the 2 wheat loaves that were brought in the Beis HaMikdash. So this is the mitzvah. The mitzvah is twofold. There's a mitzvah bringing the Karban Omer, which was the Bali offering in the Beis HaMikdash. And from that day on, which is the second day of Pesach, we count 49 days, 7 weeks of the Omer. What's interesting to point out is that according to the accepted halacha, as brought by the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch, is that in the absence of the Karban Omer, which, as we do not have a Beis HaMikdash, we don't have the Karban Omer anymore. In the absence of the Karban Omer, Al Sefiras HaOmer is no longer a mitzvah d'oraisa. It's no longer a biblical mitzvah. It is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic mitzvah, which is a zeicher l'mikdash, to remember how the mitzvah was observed in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. Which is why immediately after counting the Sefiras HaOmer each night, we add a tefillah, bakasha, Harachaman hu yachzir lanu avodas Beis HaMikdash. We ask Hashem to restore to us the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, because then once again we will be able to fulfill this mitzvah in its truest form as a mitzvah d'oraisa, as a biblical mitzvah. So that is the mitzvah as an observance, as a mitzvah. If one opens the Shulchan Aruch, one will get all of the details, exactly how we are to count the Sefiras HaOmer. Chassidus teaches that in parallel with this mitzvah, there is also a spiritual dimension to the mitzvah. The spiritual dimension of the mitzvah is that the Sefiras HaOmer is a time of personal introspection and refinement. Now, Sefiras HaOmer is really a bridge. It comes between the Yom Tov of Pesach and the Yom Tov of Shavuos. Pesach obviously being the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and Shavuos being the time of Matan Torah. But in order to get from Pesach to Shavuos, we need to go through the process of what Sefiras HaOmer represents. Not only that it's a counting down towards the giving of the Torah, but it is a time when we are preparing ourselves to be able to receive the Torah. And when Chassidus discusses these 3 stages, Yetzias Mitzrayim on Pesach, the Sefiras HaOmer in between, and then Shavuos, Chassidus connects this to a pasuk in Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim, many communities have the custom of reading Shir HaShirim on Pesach, because Shir HaShirim is a love song. It's a love story describing the relationship between a man and a woman. And Rabbi Akiva tells us that whilst the rest of the Kisvei Kodesh, the other books of the Tanakh, are Kodesh, are holy, Shir HaShirim is Kodesh Kadoshim. It is the holiest of the holies, because all of these details in Shir HaShirim are in fact a metaphor for the relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people, that we have a passionate, loving, intimate relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just like the description in the book of Shir HaShirim. So in the first chapter, in Pasuk Daled, the Sefer tells us, Mashcheni acharecha narutza heviani amelech chadarav nagila v'nismacha bach. Draw me after you, let us run. The king has brought me to his chambers. Let us delight and rejoice in your love. And Chassidus takes this pasuk and applies it to Pesach, Sefiras, Haomer, and Shavuos. And each of the parts of the pasuk allude to each of these times and the spiritual avodah that it represents. But first, by way of preface, when we talk about a relationship involves two people, and a relationship can be initiated in one of two ways. We have the male and the female. One party can initiate the relationship and the other responds to them, or they can initiate the relationship and that causes the other to respond as well. So when we talk about a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that relationship can either be in a way which we call Milmaila Lamata, from above to below, meaning that it's initiated from on high, and we respond to that initiation. That there is a gilui, there's a revelation which comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then we respond to that gilui. Another form is where it is Milmata Lamaila, from below to above. That is, we engage in Avodah, we put in the effort to draw ourselves closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu reflects that back to us and showers us with light in response to our Avodah. And in general, this is the difference between Tishrei and Nisan. We know that Elul is the Rosh Tevis for the pasuk Ani L'Doidi V'Doidi Li, also a pasuk from Shir HaShirim. I am to my beloved is to me. And that sequence is that first we are to our beloved. First we engage in Avodah, which in the month of Elul is a month of tshuva. It's a month of connecting ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu reflects that back, V'Doidi Li, during the month of Tishrei with all of the revelations of the Yom Tovim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Chag HaSukkos. But the month of Nisan is alluded to in a different pasuk in Shir HaShirim, similar, but in reverse order. Doidi li va'ani loy. My beloved is to me, and I am to him. Because on Pesach, we know that the Jewish people were in Mitzrayim, not just in a physical galus, but in a spiritual galus as well. According to the Shalom, the mystical works, they had sunken to the 49th gate of impurity, that they had become absorbed within the impurity and sinfulness of the Egyptian culture, to the extent that they did not have any mitzvahs with which to earn or deserve the redemption. And nonetheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, as we say in the Haggadah, that Ani v'loy malach, it was I and not an angel, not a saraf, not a shaliach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, b'chvoido yeva'atzmoi, in his essential state, came and he revealed himself to the Jewish people in Mitzrayim to effect the Yetzias Mitzrayim, to take them out of Mitzrayim. So Pesach was really an initiation from above. Pesach was a Gilui Elokus that came even though we were not deserving, even though we had not engaged any avodah whatsoever. That is referred to in the terminology of Kabbalah as an isarusa de la Eila, an awakening or an arousal that comes from above. But that is there to serve as the catalyst to then cause us to respond to that revelation with our own isarusa de la Sata, an awakening from below. So Pesach, if you would, Yetzias Mitzrayim was a Gilui Elokus. Hashem came and revealed himself to the Jewish people, showered them with revelation, took us out of Mitzrayim in a physical sense and a spiritual sense. But immediately after that, we need to engage in Avodah. In fact, the Alter Rebbe, in a number of Maimarim in Likutei Torah, describes that if there is an Isarusa de la Eila, there's an arousal from above, there's a flow of godly light that comes from above. If we do not respond to that, if we do not do something to contain it, to draw it down, to internalize it, then it passes by. It's there and it passes by. We need to harness it and channel it into meaningful avodah. And that is the avodah of Sefiras Haomer, which begins immediately after the first day of Pesach. So that immediately after the Gilui of Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is Milmaila Lamata, Doidi Li, we need to engage in the avodah of Va'ani Loi, the avodah of us elevating ourselves and lifting ourselves up, drawing ourselves closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is the avodah of Sefiras Haomer. When the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, the ultimate objective, the ultimate goal was to come to Matan Torah. And in fact, in terms of the analogy of a man and a woman, Matan Torah is referred to as Yom Chasunasai. It is the day of union, the day of marriage between Hashem and the Jewish people, where our relationship is forged in a very, very deep way. So when we talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim, that was the beginning of the process, but that, as we're going to see, is not enough to get us to the place where we can come to Matan Torah. So if we break down the pasuk, the beginning of the pasuk says Mashcheni. Mashcheni literally means draw me or pull me towards you. The analogy would be someone who's fallen into a pit. They're stuck down in the bottom of the pit, as the Jewish people were in Mitzrayim, in a spiritual abyss. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu pulled them out. He schlepped them out from above to below. He drew them towards him. So the first part of the pasuk, Mashcheni, draw me, refers to Matan Torah. And this word Mashcheni, Chassidus points out, is written in singular form. Draw me in singular form. Why is it in singular form? So we know that our being is made up of multiple facets. The Alter Rebbe's premise in Tanya is that we have two nefashos, we have two souls. We have a nefesh alikis, a godly soul, which craves and desires connection to Hashem, service of Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs. But we also have a nefesh bahamas, an animalistic soul. The animalistic soul desires worldliness, materialism, and selfish pursuits within the world. The godly soul is naturally aligned with spirituality, where the animalistic soul does not have a natural desire for godliness. And yet, the Shema tells us that we have to love God b'chol levavcha, with all of your heart. And Chazal tell us the word levavcha, written with two bases, alludes to the fact that we need to love Hashem and serve Him not just with our Yetzer Tov, not just with our good inclination, our godly soul, but also with our Yetzer Hara, which means that the animalistic soul itself, whilst not naturally in tune with spiritual matters or a desire for God, can be elevated and refined to a point where it too desires and craves a connection with Hashem, that it too comes to realization that godliness and spirituality is meaningful and is something to desire. So, in the very first stage of Yetzias Mitzrayim, Mashcheni, Hashem drew us out to Him. But in the absence of interpersonal work, when it was all a gilui from above, it only affects that part of ourselves which is naturally receptive to that gilui. That part of ourselves is the godly soul. So when Hashem came down to Mitzrayim, the Jewish people were stuck and immersed in the 49th gate of impurity. Their nefesh abahamis, their animalistic soul, was very much stuck and trapped. The godly soul was inspired by that revelation. That when Hashem's presence came to affect the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, it only stimulated and triggered, aroused and revealed the nefesh alikis, the godly soul. And that's why the word Mashcheni is written in singular form, to allude to the fact that only our godly soul was inspired and revealed and activated at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim on the Yom Tov of Pesach. But the animalistic soul did not change. The animalistic soul remained in its coarseness, remained in its state of materialism, and needed to be brought along with the godly soul. In fact, the Rebbe explains that is why the Jewish people had to run away from Mitzrayim. Not because Paro had any shlita over them anymore. Paro had told them they should go. They had to run out of Mitzrayim, not the Mitzrayim of Egypt, but the Mitzrayim inside of themselves. Because the godly soul was inspired and thirsting and yearning for connection to Hashem, but they had not yet changed in terms of their nefesh abahamis, their animalistic desires, and therefore had to be worried about being pulled down or held back. Sefiras Haomer, however, is the next stage, and that is alluded to in the words of the pasuk, Acharecha Nerutza. Acharecha Nerutza means behind you we will run. All of a sudden there is a change into plural form, whereas Mashcheni, which is the Exodus of Egypt, is in singular form because it only affected one dimension of our personality, which was the nefesh elikis, the godly soul. Sefiras Haomer is a time where we are engaging with our nefesh habahamis, that our nefesh habahamis should become refined, should become less animalistic, less invested in worldliness and materialism, and should start to have a desire for godliness. And therefore, the next part of the pasuk, Acharecha Nerutza, which really refers to the time of Sefiras Haomer, it is not about Memaila Lamata, but it is rather Avodah Memata Lamaila. It's a time when we are supposed to be working on ourselves. And as opposed to when the revelation comes from above, when we work on ourselves, that's when we start to change. That is when we are able to take parts of ourselves which are not in line with holiness, and we are able to refine it, we're able to elevate, and we're able to bring our full being into the picture, not just our godly soul, but also with our animalistic soul. And the Rebbe points out something fascinating. The word narutza, to run, shows a sense of energy, enthusiasm, and strength. When we talk about the nefesh habahamis, the animalistic soul, Chassidus tells us that the animalistic soul is not intrinsically bad. It may be drawn towards negative things, negative character traits, and negative behaviors, but in essence, the animalistic soul is about a drive. And just as an animal has superior power to a human being, has greater strength, so too, in a way, the animalistic soul has greater power and desire and drive than the godly soul. And this is reflected in the ideas we will see, that whereas the godly soul is primarily intellectual, and therefore the seat of the nefesh elikis is in the brain, the animalistic soul, the nefesh habahamis, is seated in the heart because it is primarily emotional. And whereas intellect can be calm, cool, and collected, emotions are powerful. Emotions are strong. Emotions can be overwhelming. And therefore, that whilst the godly soul has a desire for godliness, it is like the calm, cool intellect. And therefore, in a way, if we take an analogy, the nefesh elikis walks towards holiness. But the animalistic soul, which has a greater strength of emotion, when it is inspired, when it's turned on, and comes to desire godliness, whatever the animalistic soul desires, it does so with a passion. It runs towards it. In a way, if you look at a child, children don't walk. Children run to everything because they've got this excitement, they've got an exuberance, they've got a passion. The animalistic soul has a maila, has an advantage over the godly soul in that it is passionate. So therefore, when we refine the nefesh habahamis during the time of Sefiras Haomer, to come to a point where it too desires godliness, it doesn't just walk towards godliness, it runs. It's driven with a passion, with a greater vigor and a greater strength. And that has a rub-off effect on the nefesh elikis, on the godly soul. Just like a person, when they ride on a horse, they ride with greater strength, with greater force and greater pace. So too, when the nefesh elikis refines the nefesh habahamis, then that running, that drive, that passion of the nefesh habahamis affects the nefesh elikis as well, that it too should be able to have this tremendously strong desire for godliness. And then when we have done that, when we've successfully refined not only our godly soul, but the animalistic soul as well, we come to the conclusion of the pasuk, Heviyani Amelech Hadar, of the king brings me into his chamber, which is the metaphor for the marital home. And that represents the giving of the Torah on Shavuos, which is the forging of the relationship when Nismechabach, we will rejoice in Hashem. So that's the overview. We have Pesach, which is a revelation from above to below, which drew the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim, but only activated, triggered the godly soul. We then have Sefiras Haomer, as we're going to focus on, which is a time of birur of the nefesh habahamis, refining the animalistic soul, so we are able to tap into its greater strength and passion and channel that, direct that towards the service of Hashem. And then finally, we come to Matan Torah with our whole selves to be able to enter into this union with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if we hone in on the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer, what does the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer mean? How is that related to the birur, the refining of the animalistic soul? So another place where the mitzvah of Sefiras Haomer is discussed in the Torah is in Book of Devarim. In Book of Devarim, Perek Tezayin, the pasuk tells us, Shiva Shavuos Tispar Lach, you should count for yourself 7 weeks. Mehachel Chemesh Bakama, from the time you should start from when the sickle first comes to the standing grain. Tachel Lispar, you should begin to count Shiva Shavuos 7 weeks. So that means from the time that the standing barley grain is harvested, we begin to count these 7 weeks. And as we're going to see in a moment, this process of harvesting the Omer is very much related to the animalistic soul, to the Nefesh HaBahamas. How is that? So there are 2 primary grains. One is wheat and the other is barley. In general, in the writings of Chazal, wheat is considered Maicho Adam, is considered food for man. Man eats more refined foods, and that is wheat. Barley, however, whilst it was also consumed by people, primarily was seen as fodder for animals. So barley represents animal food. And therefore, in our context, wheat is connected to the godly soul, which is the Adam, the man inside of ourselves, whereas barley is connected to the Nefesh HaBahamas, the animalistic self, which is the behemoth inside of ourselves. And what the pasuk tells us is that we need to take a chermesh. A chermesh is a sickle. A sickle is used to cut. And we need to take that sickle to the grain, which in this case is barley, which means that we need to take the sickle to our Nefesh HaBahamas to cut away all of its negative expressions, its negative urges and impulses and emotions, its negative character traits, and to cut them away till we can get back to that restored essence of the animalistic soul, which can then be redirected to higher purposes. And in fact, if we look in this pasuk, it describes the grain as kama. Kama means standing, that it's the grain while it is still standing and growing in the field. The Rishonim learn from this pasuk that Sefiras Omer should be said while standing up. And they make a drush on this word bakama and say, al tikre bakama, do not read it as kama, the standing grain, but rather as bakoima. Koima means the height of a person. What does that mean, the height of a person? So according to Chassidus, this means the spiritual makeup, the structure of the soul. According to Kabbalah, we have different koiches of the nefesh. We have our intellect and our emotions. But in general, these midos, which parallel, which reflect the sefiros above, form the image of man. Chesed, which is giving, is connected to the right hand. Gevurah is connected to the left hand. Of course, Chachma, Bin, and Das are the intellectual sefiros. Tiferes is connected to the torso, to the heart. Netzach, Hoid are the legs. And Yesoid is the reproductive organs. So when we talk about the spiritual koima, the spiritual makeup of the form of man, we are referring to the midos, the koichos, the intellect, and the emotion, the drivers of the soul. And in our case, we are talking about the nefesh habahamis, we're talking about the animalistic soul. And therefore, when the pasuk says, bakama, you have to take a sickle to the grain, it means that we have to take each of the facets of our animalistic soul, each of the expressions of the nefesh habahamis, each of the character traits of the nefesh habahamis, and we need to use a spiritual sickle to refine, to cut away their negative expressions and to channel them and direct them in a positive way, in a holy way. And this is the avodah of Sefiras Omer, milmata lamaila, from below to above. Okay, so in order to understand this a little bit better, I'm going to look at a entry in Hayom Yom. Hayom Yom, of course, which is a calendar that was written by the Rebbe with a daily note, a daily teaching, a daily anecdote. So we have the pasuk, Usfartem lachem mimachras haShabbos, which is the source of the mitzvah of Sefiras Omer. In Hayom Yom, for the 10th day of Iyar, which we're still coming up to, the Rebbe brings a Torah from the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe explained this mitzvah in its mystical sense and says as follows: Usfartem lachem. The word usfartem means to count for yourselves, but usfartem also comes from the word sapirus. Sapirus means to be brilliant or radiant, to shine. So the words usfartem lachem can also mean you shall make yourselves shine. Yourselves, your lachem, refers not to our godly soul, which naturally shines and radiates holiness. It refers to our animalistic soul, which does not naturally shine. And we need to polish it. We need to refine it. We need to make it shine. Our lachem. We need to make ourselves shine. And the Alter Rebbe says, Uvamer, with what does one brighten the lachem? How do we make ourselves shine? So the pasuk says, Shiva Shavuos Tmimois, with 7 complete weeks. And the 7 weeks correspond to the 7 emotive drives of the animalistic soul, the 7 midos of the nefesh habahamas. And we need to refine these 7 emotional traits of the nefesh habahamas one at a time so that they all become Sheva Shabbosos. Now we know on Shabbos we don't perform malacha. One of the malachas that we do not do on Shabbos is boirer. Boirer is the process of refining to separate good from evil or evil from good. On Shabbos we no longer perform the malacha of boirer because on Shabbos, Shabbos is refined. Everything on Shabbos becomes elevated to the extent that there is no need for refinement anymore. So what we do during Sefiras Haomer is we take the naturally coarse midos of our nefesh habahamas, and we need to, day after day, night after night, work on refining those character traits until they become Sheva Shabbosos, until they become refined as well. Now, going back to this idea of the nefesh habahamas being reflected in Sefiras Haomer, so we have a Mishnah in Masechta Soita. We know that there were different mincha offerings brought in the Beis HaMikdash. All of the mincha offerings in the Beis HaMikdash were of wheat, with the exception of 2 offerings. One was the mincha of the soita. A soita, a suspected woman who was suspected of immoral behavior, had to bring a korban Omer that was a korban that was made of barley. And the second was the korban Omer. And the Mishnah in Soita says, why is it that all of the other offerings, the mincha offerings, were of wheat, yet the soita had to bring an offering of barley? Just as this woman acted in an animalistic way, so too her korban is from barley, which is the food of an animal, is the fodder of an animal. Taking this idea of the soita, that the barley offering is connected to animalism, the korban Omer is also connected to animalism. It's connected to our nefesh habahamas and the beginning of the process of refining our nefesh habahamas. And this too is alluded to in the korban of the Omer. The barley that was used for the korban Omer was sifted multiple times. It was sifted 13 times, so that in the end you had the purest of the pure flour. And the idea of sifting is also the idea of separating out the negative or the undesirable until you are left with the soiles, the best of the best. So too, the Sefiras Haomer is a time where we are sifting ourselves. We're sifting to remove all of the negative expressions, all of our negative character traits, until we are refined as well. Okay, so when we talk about the animalistic soul, as discussed before, whereas the godly soul is primarily intellectual, the animalistic soul is primarily driven by its emotions. Chassidus talks about, based on Kabbalah, 7 emotional drives of a person. Chesed, which is an expression of love or closeness. Gevura, which is an expression of distance. Sefiras, which is harmony, synthesis. Netzach, which is ambition. Hoid, submission. Yesoid is connection. And Malchus, finally, is expression. So when we talk about these 7 emotional qualities, they can exist within our godly soul, but they also exist within our animalistic soul. What is the difference between them? So as mentioned before, the godly soul, everything about it is about connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, all of its midos, all of its character traits, all of its drives are focused on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So its chesed, which in general is the midah of ahava, love, is a love for God, is a love for Hashem. In contrast, the nefesh habahamas is a corrupted form of chesed. The chesed is not about other people. It's not for Hashem, but it's a self-serving chesed. It is about love and desire for that which satisfies my needs, my wants, my desires. And generally speaking, for the animalistic soul, that refers to gashmius. It refers to materialism. Gevura is also a midah that is more about fear or distance. And in its corrupted form, instead of being focused on Hashem, that is the emotion of anger. The emotion of anger, which is an expression of the nefesh habahamas or the gevura of the nefesh habahamas. And the idea of Sefiras Haomer is that the 7 weeks correspond to these 7 midos. So each week focuses on a different one of these midos, the expressions of the animalistic soul, working to refine it. But when we talk about Sefiras Haomer, there is a mitzvah to count the days, and there is a mitzvah to count the weeks. And that is based on the psukim of the Torah, and that's why when we count the Sefiras Haomer, we say, Hayoim, today is the 20th day of the Omer, which is 2 weeks and 6 days. That is because there is a mitzvah to count the days as well as counting the weeks. When we talk about the counting of the Omer as reflecting a spiritual avodah of refining ourselves, refining our nefesh Bahamas, there is also the idea of refining the weeks and refining the days. Refining the weeks represents a high-level refinement or an overarching refinement of each midah, so that our chesed of our nefesh Bahamas becomes completely transformed, completely made over. We generally are not capable of achieving that. Tzaddikim have control over their full emotional selves. We are not able to completely make over our nefesh Bahamas, that its chesed, its drives of desire, or its gevura, its sense of discipline, are completely transformed. But what we can do is to focus on the more nuanced expressions of the middos of the nefesh Bahamas, and that is the idea of counting the days. And here we introduce an idea which is discussed in Chassidus, and that is the concept of hiskalus. Hiskalus means integration. So, for example, if we talk about chesed, which in general is love, we can express and experience love or desire in different ways. There's not one singular homogeneous way that we experience the emotion of chesed or the emotion of love. There are more nuanced expressions of that. And that is because of this concept of hiskalus, which means that every midah comprises the elements of all of the others. And of course, we've been counting the Sefiras Omer, and after Sefiras Omer, we find in the Siddur different tefillos that are said, and we say a Kabbalistic prayer where we say to Hashem, Ribono Shel Olam, we mention there the idea that we are refining the different middos. Each night corresponds to a different facet, to a different midah. So there are 49 different expressions of the nefesh Bahamas, or 49 different levels within the Sefiras above. And each night we express or we focus on refining a different element of that. Now, it's a whole big machlokas whether those tefillos should be said. They're really deep Kabbalistic ideas. Not everyone is proficient, but the Alter Rebbe included this in the Siddur, meaning that it is an avodah which is shaykh to each person on their level. And whilst we might not be able to completely in 1 year or even in 1 day transform our nefesh Bahamas, but each night we're supposed to focus, or each day of Sefiras Omer, just on refining ourselves a little bit more to become less animalistic and to become more godly, to become less engaged and driven and interested in the material, in the selfish, and to become more in tune and in sync with that which is holy. So to explain this idea of hiskalus, so we have the 7 middos, and we're going to focus on the emotional qualities, chesed, gevura, tiferes, netzach, chod, yesod, and malchus. So if we take, for example, chesed, the idea of hiskalus is that the chesed is not just one simple midah, but it comprises different layers. So you have chesed, sheba chesed, gevura sheba chesed, tiferes sheba chesed, and so on and so forth. So what does that actually mean? If we take, for example, chesed sheba chesed, chesed in general is love. Love can be expressed in a way of affection, and that would be chesed sheba chesed, where you have open, revealed love. So when you express your love to a child through hugging them, through kissing them, that is an expression of chesed sheba chesed, love that is expressed in a manner of love. Gevura sheba chesed, in contrast, is still a midah of chesed. It's still part of showing love, affection, but it is done so in a way of chesed. The classic paradigm for this would be when a parent disciplines a child. Whilst the discipline is an outward expression of gevura, but what motivates, what is driving, what is the overarching objective of the discipline, it is motivated by the chesed, the love that the parent has towards their child and desire to see them to go in the right way. So when a parent disciplines a child, that is gevura within chesed, or chesed being expressed in a way of gevura, and so on and so forth. There are a number of Maimarim from the Rebbe, based on Maimarim of the Rebbe Rashab, which goes through not all 49 spheres, not all 49 facets, but gives examples of the different subsets of chesed from which we can extrapolate what all 49 middos might look like. So if we take this example of chesed, and that's what we're going to conclude with, we'll just run through this idea of chesed. So you have chesed sheba chesed. What is chesed sheba chesed? So in general, chesed shebechesed is about a revealed strong love. And again, for the godly soul, that is a revealed strong love that is focused on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Whereas for the nefesh habahamis, the chesed shebechesed and nefesh habahamis is a strong desire or lust for material worldly pleasures. So it's a desire and passion in Gashmis. What would be Gevura Shebechesed? Gevura Shebechesed is love that is expressed in hate, or love that is expressed in Gevura. For the godly soul, what would that be? Hatred to that which is opposed to Hashem. In Tanya, the Alter Rebbe talks about tzaddikim being moyes bara, having this despise or disgust for that which is negative. So for the godly soul, its ahava, its chesed for Hashem can be expressed in Gevura, which is that disdain or hatred towards anything which is opposed to Hashem, be it that which is forbidden, be it the klippos, or be it those who go against the will of Hashem. For the nefesh habahamis, however, is hatred to those who obstruct the nefesh habahamis from actualizing its desires. So the nefesh habahamis has a desire for selfish material pursuits, and if someone stands in its way or tries to prevent it from getting to its gevura, so getting to its desires, so then the nefesh habahamis will have a revulsion or a hatred towards that which stands in the way of it obtaining its desire. So that would be example of gevura shebechesed and how we should be working on the gevura shebechesed of the nefesh habahamis. What is tiferes shebechesed? Love that is beautified, or to take pride in one's love. The word tiferes can mean beauty, and that is, for example, hidur mitzvah, when we don't just do a mitzvah, but we do it in a way which is beautified. But tiferes also comes from the word hispirus, which means to boast or to be proud of something. So the nefesh alakis has a pride in the beauty of Torah and mitzvahs. That when one looks and sees a person engaged in Torah and mitzvahs, we feel a sense of pride. We feel a sense of, wow, look how special and precious what we have is. For the nefesh habahamis, it means to boast about one's worldly desires and pursuits. So it's not enough that the nefesh habahamis has worldly desires and pursuits, but it boasts and takes pleasure in praising the quality or the value of one's desires. And that would be the example of tiferes shebechesed for nefesh habahamis. What is netzach shebechesed? Netzach is ambition, and that means a resolve to attain one's love, or the object of one's love, even when it is challenging, even when there are manias v'ikuvim, there are obstructions in the way. For the godly soul, that means to compel oneself, to force oneself, or resolve to overcome any obstacles that are there to the service of Hashem. And netzach shebechesed can also mean self-control, where we menatzeach on ourselves, we rule over ourselves to do that which what Hashem desires. For the nefesh habahamis, that refers to a stubborn determination to attain its desires and not to be deterred. So that even if someone tells them that this is not an appropriate thing to desire, nonetheless, the nefesh habahamis has an akshanos, and that akshanos comes from the netzach shebechesed of the nefesh habahamis. Hoid shebechesed is to be prepared to fight to obtain one's love, not just a resolve, but if needs be, to prepare to fight against those which oppose us. For the godly soul means that which oppose the nefesh habahamis, that opposes the godly soul serving Hashem. But for the nefesh habahamis, it means to fight against that which gets one in one's way, to outwardly rebel, and not to be ashamed or embarrassed when people tell you that you're not doing the right thing. Yesoid shebechesed, yesoid means to bond or connect. And I think in this sense, it means to be absolutely infatuated with one's desire. So for the godly soul, it means to bind oneself completely to Torah mitzvahs, even if one doesn't have a feeling, but you bind yourself to it. For the nefesh habahamis means to irrationally bind yourself up. In a way, it's almost like an addiction, a compulsion, where you are so enraptured and so bound up for your desire that even when you know that it is harmful, you are not nispol, you don't take any heed because you are so attached to that desire. And finally, we get to Malchus Shebechesed. Malchus, in general, according to Kabbalah, is associated with the mouth, and that is speech. But also, by extension, it refers to all of the levushim of the neshama, which is the machshava, dibur, maisa. That's the expression of our emotions by channeling them into our behaviors in thought, speech, and action. So Malchus Shebechesed, in general, is to act about one's love, or to act out upon one's love, or to speak about one's love. For the godly soul, It means to apply the desires of the godly soul, the emotions of the godly soul, to apply the emotions of the godly soul in the Torah, into actions of Torah and mitzvahs. And for the Nefesh Bahamis, it means to speak about or to actually actualize in thought, speech, and action, forbidden speech, the desires of the animalistic soul. So that's an example within Chesed Shebechesed, and the same process can be done in a way of Gevura and Midos of Gevura, Sefiras, and Hoid. Now, just interesting, there was a question which was asked, and it's a very, very good question. Mendy Rimler asked a question. The question is that often we associate, and I mentioned before, that Hoid means submission, whereas Netzach is ambition, Hoid means submission or humility. That is true. In many other places, that is how the midah of Hoid is described. In the Maimer Tafshin Yud Aleph, Tafshin and Yud Ches, where the Rebbe is talking about the midos in the context of Sefiras Omer, the Rebbe points out that Hoid finds itself on the left column. The Sefiras can be divided into the three columns: the right side, which is the Kav HaChesed, the left side, which is Kav HaGevura. And therefore, Hoid finds itself on the Kav of Gevura, and Hoid is called an Anaf, an offshoot of the midah of Gevura. And therefore, in this context, Hoid means to fight. It means to fight, to overcome the obstacles as they present themselves to us. So it's true that elsewhere Hoid is explained as being humility, and certainly there is the idea of surrender to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the idea of bittul, Kabbalas O, which is an expression of Hoid. And therefore, there's also the aspect that Sefiras Omer is a time where the sphere of Hoid is working on the submission of the Nefesh HaBahamis to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So each night of Sefiras Omer, each of the 49 days takes a different one of the aspects of the Nefesh HaBahamis. And whilst we might not be able to totally make ourselves over, that each individual nuanced expression of the Nefesh HaBahamis can become a little bit more edel, can become a little bit more refined and directed towards a desire for Kedusha and be channeled in the service of Hashem. And when we do this, when we do our avodah of Sefiras Omer, we combine the two together. The Pesach was the Gilui Milmaila Lamata. We have the revelation of godliness from above to below. We then channel that into Avodah Mamata Lamaila, which is where we bring our animalistic self along in the process as well, where we refine ourselves in a complete way, not just the godly soul, but the Nefesh HaBahamis as well. And then as a result of this, we come finally to Shavuos, to Matan Torah, and Matan Torah is the synthesis of the two together. Matan Torah is the combination of Mamaila Lamata. HaKadosh Baruch Hu came down from Har Sinai into our world, and we, Moshe Allah Lamarim, Moshe ascended, representing how the world ascends and becomes elevated. And then that is the true simcha. The true ultimate simcha is when the two avodas of Mamaila Lamata and Mamata Lamaila come together. We can't get there, obviously, without the avodah of Sefiras Omer. So as we continue on with our Sefiras Omer, counting the rest of the nights of the week, it's appropriate to take a few moments as we say each Sefira and to think, how would that play out in my life? How does that reflect in my own Nefesh HaBahamis? And how can I take that and in one detail, one aspect, make myself a little bit more godly, a little bit more elevated, and a little bit more refined? And when we do that, Be'ezras Hashem, we should have the fulfillment of the tefillah that we say after counting Sefiras Omer, Harachamunu Yachzir Lanu Avodas Beis HaMikdash. We should have the restoring of the Beis HaMikdash and all of the karbanos, and once again be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Sefiras Omer in its complete way. And Be'ezras Hashem, it should happen takeoff for Miyad Mamish.
A grace and dank, Rabbi.
Okay, have a wonderful night. Hope you'll join us again for future shiurim.
Keep me included. Bye-bye.
Will do.